1190 WIB Radio, the Key of Life, and I'm Gary Bird. You're inside of the GBE on this Monday afternoon, May 9th, 1988. Thank you for joining us in the experience. As I promised, my guest this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson, psychologist, author, professor, and entrepreneur. He is the author of the Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, which was published in 1978 by Africana Research Publications in Harlem. He's born and raised in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and takes a rather radical view towards the educational process and redefining it in order to educate African children according to their very own psychology. Dr. Wilson, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be back, Gary.
We started off the broadcast this afternoon dealing with the question, and some callers were still with us on the line, what can be done to disarm the school system as it stands today, and how does the changing atmosphere of the school system with the kind of metal detectors and police involvement and so forth affect children who do want to learn? What are your thoughts about that question before we really begin?
Well, certainly the school atmosphere must be controlled and dealt with. For instance, there was the controversial Joe Clark situation. While my feelings are mixed, I certainly am on his side as far as the idea that order must be brought about within the school structure and some kind of learning environment be maintained. And you cannot maintain a learning environment when people are afraid for their lives, or there are strangers intruding into the school in a threatening sort of way. And just where there's general disruption and students have overstayed their time and whose concerns are disruptive to other students. Preferably, I would like to see it controlled, in a sense, by the principal and by the school personnel itself. I'd prefer that the police not be brought into the situation. And of course, if it could be helped, certainly metal detectors and that kind of atmosphere should not be put into the schools. Only there as a last resort when nothing else works. But I believe there are other workable ways of controlling the school atmosphere and the school circumstances. But we must, the administration and the community must gain control of what goes on within the school house and the school building itself.
When you say that you think that there are other approaches, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'm talking about, I don't have such definite approaches in mind, but I'm relying on our ability to come together as a community to arrive at those approaches. Whether that means parental controls, some other group of community organization patrolling, or the reduction in the sizes of schools. Sometimes I think these schools are really absolutely too large, particularly in terms of the kind of students we deal with here, where you have maybe 2,000 or 3,000 students in one building, where often then the principals and other people in the school have a greater difficulty in getting to know the students and getting a sense of where students are supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing. So those things might be instituted as well. But in some way, the community itself must be involved, and the parents and people whose children attend these schools should be involved in organizing a way of controlling the atmosphere of the school. What that will be, I think, will be flexible depending on the community.
When we tie in your remarks in the last broadcast dealing with psychological stereotyping and its effect on African people, let's maybe aim that for the moment at the children. And I know you've given a lot of attention to this.
Yes.
How does that particular issue play into our own perception of ourselves in terms of the children?
You were referring to the statement I think I made toward the end of the program when I talked about the system of oppression being an immaturizing process. When the other people, say, may refer to us as boys, it is not just an attempt to put us down, but it is a part of an attempt to actually create in grown men an immature personality. That immature personality, of course, being one that cannot successfully challenge the system as it is. And that is achieved by withholding certain experiences from our children in the schools, certain experiences in life, those experiences being necessary for growth and development and growth into manhood and into to womanhood. So the poorness of schools are a part of that process. Job discrimination is a part of that process. Bringing about a feeling of powerlessness and direct and overreactive opposition to our desires and wishes is also a part of that process, because these things are used to create in us a sense of powerlessness, an inability to do something about ourselves, and maintain in us a state of dependence which is quite characteristic of young children. So the oppressive system is set up by its very restrictions and by its stereotypes, you see, to create a mentality that retards mental and psychological growth. It is there also not only to immaturize us as people in general, but to feminize us as men as well. To emasculate the black man. And of course, we've talked about that a great deal, you know, I'm sure on these microphones. You can see that even in the kind of leadership we provide. And when I use that word feminize, I'm speaking of it in the old stereotypical sense of where a certain dependency was created and maintained, where let me just be more straightforward about it. In the older sense, before liberation, or before the impact of women's liberation became very apparent and effective, often many women, and not all women by any stretch of the imagination, thought that their route to, say, power and prestige and acceptance was basically through marriage, through becoming attached to some man and assuming his name or his identity. And therefore, she would get a vicarious kind of power if her husband was powerful, if she carried the name of the husband, and so forth. And so her major approaches under that old system was one of seduction, that is, seducing a man perhaps into marriage, seducing him into attachment, or sometimes a process of inducing guilt or a sense of protectiveness on the part of the man, you know, these kinds of things. Or the greater part of her energies might have been directed toward making herself attractive instead of developing her intellectual and other potentials. So her approach in the older sense, and I want to be clear about that because I don't want any misunderstandings of people. In the older sense then, it was going at power indirectly through attachments. Now, to a good degree, I think that the assimilationist approach to the movement of our people is a very similar one and sort of feminine in that sense. It's not an approach that directly challenges the power of Europeans or the power of the white man. It is not an approach that is ready to go to war and to defeat our enemies. When we talk about racism, you see, we talk about racism, but we don't talk about it in a way that we can neutralize the racists. We talk about it more in the way of getting the racist to change his or her attitude, or to change their feelings toward us, or to accept us, in a sense, to marry us and to become one with us. But there's another way, of course, approaching it that says, look, you can be as racist as you want to. You can hate me and you can despise me, but you are not in a position to do a damn thing about it, because I have power to prevent you from carrying out your racist plans. You see, and we, of course, now again, stereotypically see that as a masculine approach, and again, I'm using it just as a term of convenience, that says, look, we are moving from a position of power, and we want to build our own IBMs, our own Xerox Corporation, our own armies, our own nations, and not marry into you and become attached to you through some kind of curious identification with you. Because what happens is that still leaves you disarmed. It still leaves you in a position that if your husband divorces you, you're not in a position to carry on your own life and protect your own interests. It still leaves you in a position that if your quote-unquote husband decides that he will attack you or drop you in some kind of way, it still doesn't prepare you to provide for yourself and to take care of yourself. So integrationism that does not set us up for the assumption of real power and real control of the means of productions and so forth is, in my way of viewing it, a type of feminist approach.
Okay, we're going to take a break for news headlines in the half hour. And for those of you listening who may have some questions already, and I'm sure some of you do, 692-9542 in Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Long Island, Staten Island, in New Jersey, upstate and out-of-state, 1-800-332-1023. My guest this afternoon is Dr. Amos Wilson. If you had an opportunity of catching a version of Tony Brown's journal yesterday, you probably have some very interesting points of view to maybe share with us this afternoon, hearing our guest remarks this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson. That program featured a number of black homosexuals who were in the broadcast and who had some rather unique views related to the issue of feminization and also the issue of stereotyping as well. Some of them may be listening. If you are, then you are free to call us as well. That'll add another dimension to the conversation this afternoon. And we'll also come back to pick up a bit on the points that Dr. Amos Wilson has projected, and also to expand a bit on the issue of psychological stereotyping and its effect on African people. As you've heard him indicate, it is his feeling that oppression creates an immaturization of the mind, and that is one of the things that we have to deal with. And I think that when we go back to talking about the issue of young people, to some extent, what they may be showing us is a rejection of that particular value system. We'll come back and explore that with Dr. Wilson and you right after news headlines.
Gary Bird Experience.
From WLIB Radio in the Key of Life, and you're inside of the GBE on this Monday afternoon, May 9th, 1988. Our guest this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson, psychologist, author, professor, and entrepreneur at the Harlem Graphic Arts Center at 243 West 125th Street. Joining us this afternoon in part two of our conversation, dealing with educating black children according to their own psychology, and this afternoon bringing in a rather interesting dimension, and an important one as well, on the issue of psychological stereotyping and its effect on African people. Dr. Wilson, as you've heard in the last few moments, talks about how oppression creates a immaturization of the mind. And this afternoon, Dr. Wilson, as you were talking just a few moments ago in terms of our identification with integration and what you call the kind of feminization, if you will, of us as men and as a people, there was something that you were referring to as far as the idea of moving from helplessness into power positions that I found interesting, because in terms of the sort of dimension you were talking about, it had a definite Marcus Garvey ring to it.
Oh,
but it also made me reflect a bit on Booker T. Washington and what I guess some might look at as a kind of flip side of the coin. Was Booker T. Washington, in this context that we're talking about, actually attempting to make these kinds of steps that we're discussing now?
I think it could have developed in that direction. Certainly the practical side of what he was advocating would have been of great importance to us.
The part where you said conceivably you put a person in a position, or a group of people in a position where you may not like me, you may say whatever you wish, but I have rendered you helpless to stop me.
Yes.
Could that have been something
that could have been the outcome of it, because how can you really do that if you are still dependent and more dependent than you need to be on other individuals, when you need not only their economic aid, but you also need their psychological acceptance. And to a great degree, a lot of the integrationist movement was motivated by a need for psychological acceptance and by a desire, and often we've confused that movement with education. The idea, you know, I sometimes derisively say, these people sort of moved as if 2 plus 2 can't be 4 in Harlem. That you got to go outside to learn the 2 plus. But 2 plus 2 is 4 in Harlem. 2 plus 2 is 4 in a black school, the same way it is in a white school. It's not really necessary that our children go to these other people's schools to learn what is necessary for them to know. Even though this was projected this way, apparently by some people, but which really covered over the need among some of these people to really be loved and accepted. And often that need overshadows their academic needs to the extent where, in some instances, if you can demonstrate that a predominantly black school or all black school is academically superior to a white one, there'll still be many of us motivated to take our children over to the white one. And often I've heard this where the parent says, well, I want them to learn to live with other people and this and that, all kinds of little phony excuses that we get. And the idea being what is most important to them is the acceptance and love of these other people rather than the academic and character preparation of their own children. And where it's the acceptance and love by these people which becomes the key motive for our behavior rather than power.
Now, before we go to our phones, there were a number of our callers when we posed our question this afternoon, which you responded to towards the top of the broadcast of what can be done to disarm the school system and how does the changing environment affect the children who do want to learn. When we talk about those children in the school system, a number of our callers seem to point towards the dimension of the school system which they didn't feel was motivating, that there were young people who are going to school who are basically being fed and given information that really does not give them a motivating vision of themselves or their role in society or history. How do you feel about that and how that ultimately leads to the kind of dropout rate that we see?
That's the way it has to be under a system of oppression. As we stated in our last conversation, the idea that the oppressor will give you a liberating education is a contradiction in terms. And to expect, I sometimes graphically put it this way. If the domination of Europeans depends upon our ignorance, and to a certain degree it does, and on a number of other factors, then the schools will educate you into ignorance. It becomes the function of the school to make you ignorant. The school is not going to... We have to recognize one thing. The function of all the institutions in this society is to maintain the status quo. There are no exceptions. The school is not an exception to that need for the Europeans to maintain power and domination over black people. As in any other institution, whether it's the family institution, whether it's the criminal justice institution, whether it's the economic institutions, the church, you name the social institution, and you'll find that all of them have in common, in relationship to black people, the maintaining of us in a position of subordination.
This puts an
and therefore, when they relate to us, they will work in a way that is in opposition to their apparent title. And therefore, education is going to ultimately make you dumb. Even while it's giving you information. So, I mean, there is a kind of education that doesn't give you anything, that leaves you really totally ignorant.
Right.
And then there's the education that has given you all the wrong kind of information, or the information has been set up in a context where it is unusable. Let me just give you a quick illustration of it, because let's use an area that most people see as neutral. Let's say science.
Okay, fine.
Okay. And some people say, well, how can you be racist in science, an atom is an atom, and this is that, physics is physics, and engineering is engineering, you see. However, you have to recognize that there is a sociology of science, that science does not develop just from genius alone, even though this is the way it's usually taught in the Eurocentrically oriented school. That, for instance, physics was advanced by Einstein's brain. Okay, but physics was not necessarily advanced by Einstein's brain. It was advanced by a particular political social system. And Einstein happened to exist in that system. If he had the same brain and existed outside of that system, he would not have made that contribution. That contribution that Einstein made is only possible within a cultural setting and within a cultural context. you see. Therefore, science is produced not merely by having some scientific geniuses, but by having a particular set of political, economic circumstances existent at a time. And those circumstances motivate scientific thinking, creativity, research, and development, you see. And therefore, it is not enough just to teach a black student in a physics class the principle of physics. That student should also learn the politics of science, the economy of science, and the connection between science, politics, economic development, and other things. Because as a black scientist, he must not only know the technique of science, he must know how to become a politician and create the political, social, economic atmosphere necessary for science to take place. And for otherwise, you'll have exactly what we have today. The production of black scientific geniuses working for NASA and other organizations, IBM, AT&T, who are producing for the very people we are talking about as oppressing us, because they have no economic and social system to operate within, so that their genius can be used to the advancement of black people.
I'm going to ask you a question before we go to our lines, and boy, we've got a full lineup of telephone callers, but you provoked this question as well. Does this set up a matrix where there is a need to differentiate in terms of the consciousness that you just described in that particular personality between a black American and an African American?
I sort of use them somewhat.
They tend to be used interchangeably,
even though you can make some fine points.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because when you said that, I mean, conceivably that individual that you just described could have been a person who was climbing the ladder of success, doing all the things that one does to move in the society and staying out of problems, and ultimately they achieved the professional status, but they did not have the consciousness. And in that sense, does that make the black American, in the terms of the one who is into just being a black, who is part of the American system, different from a person who is an African?
In that sense, they are, particularly if you use the word African in the sense of being Afrocentric, of a person who's consciously and chronically concerned with how his talents and abilities can contribute to the advancement and the survival of black people. And in the context of the scientist, the African American in that instance is not going to be satisfied with just making it to the top. He is going to become concerned very much with transferring knowledge and information over to the African scene. He's going to recognize that he cannot accept the role as it is defined by Europeans. One of the things, when we talk about education, one of the things I try to get across to black teachers, you cannot accept the definition of teacher as it is defined by Europeans. You see, our definition of ourselves as professionals, as African-American professionals, must be broader than the way Europeans define themselves, you see. Because the Europeans already have an infrastructure built. They already have their economic, social, political system set up. And therefore, their teachers and professionals can act almost as technicians or technocrats. But whereas we as Africans who are trying to create a system, a political, social, economic system, it means then that we as black professionals must have, besides our professional interests, political, economic, and other interests. And we must have a working knowledge as to how those interests impact upon our profession, and how we can use our profession in tandem with those interests to develop a nation and to develop a sense of peoplehood. So the black teacher, the African teacher, cannot just be a teacher. He or she must also be involved politically with trying to change the political structure of the system of which they are part. They cannot even be a 9th grade teacher. Okay, or a 7th grade teacher, because that hinders people. For instance, a teacher that defines himself or herself as a 7th grade teacher is often in a dilemma when the vast majority of the students, or a large percentage of the students, coming into his or her grade room, classroom is not at the 7th grade level. And many of them then are caught in the dilemma of not meeting the students at the level in which they enter the room because they view themselves as 7th grade teachers and not as teachers of human beings and not as teachers of the students that confront them. And they feel demeaned then if they have to, say, teach on a 6th grade level in what they consider a 7th grade class. And they feel frustrated, upset, or they may not really go into teaching these children with any enthusiasm because of the definition. Before you go to the phone, let me just touch on one or two things, because we got involved with the purpose of education last week, and I mentioned that I want to just add, when we talk about the education of our children, we must not only look at education as a preparation for jobs and a preparation for social mobility, which you mentioned a while ago, which is also a part of education, obviously.
Sure.
But we must look at education as a preparation for revolution. I've often stated that the central focus of the education of the white child is conservative, to maintain the advantage that whites already have, that Europeans already have, and to advance those interests. So it's essentially conservative, keeping what they have and enhancing what they have. Since we have little and we have much to gain, our education cannot be the same. That's the reason why I attack the concept of same education, equal education, as really being meaningless in the context in which, how do we have the same education as a white child when our goals are so different? In fact, our goals may involve taking back what they have stolen from us. And you have to prepare and educate the children to do that. But to give them the same education assumes that they have the same goals, you see. And so when we see our children, our people subordinated all over this globe, they're having their wealth taken and exploited and destroyed, we see our position in this world, a large majority being ruled over by a minority, we are talking about revolution. And the children should be educated for revolution. They should also be educated for mastery, that is, control of ourselves and control of our destiny, and ultimately perhaps even educated for war in the pure military sense of the word as well. We must be prepared to defend our interests if it is necessary on a military basis. We must think the unthinkable. And even though for many people our confronting Europeans in that position seems unthinkable, we must think that, and we must prepare for that, hoping that it will not have to happen, but preparing for the possibility that it will happen. The other thing when we talk about the education of black children is this world order now that is under the influence of European is a rotten, stinking, backwards world order. It is a regressive world order. It is built on racism and rape and robbery and killing and murder and lying. It is built upon a threat to life on earth itself. We mistakenly perceive these people who are in control of this earth today as being normal and civilized when they perhaps represent the most depraved group to ever be in a position of influence in the world. This group must be removed and their values must be replaced by a new set of values. That means that our children must not only be motivated to share in jobs with Europeans and get equal pay in a rotten system, they must be prepared to transform this system and to bring into being a new world order, a new set of values. So, and therefore, again, they cannot have the same education, the equal education, and the kind of nonsense we hear people rattling off about time and time again. If we have been the victims of racism and the victims of all the things we complain about, when we move in a position of mastery and influence in the world as African people, then we should be the people who are most sensitive to creating a world that is not dependent upon racism and lies, rape and robbery, you see. So consequently, our children need an Afrocentric education because it means bringing into being a whole new set of values and priorities. One other thing I want to mention in that, and that is this, that we've been knocked out of every economic niche in this society. You will see almost every ethnic group in New York City having some kind of niche. One group has got the newsstands, another group's got the vegetable stands, another one has got fish and chips market, the other one got the grocery stores, and the other one has got this, another one has got that. And you know about the only thing now that's left to black people is the selling of drugs. because in a sense, because literally the economic niches in this town have been identified with another group of people. The Italians have sanitation and construction, and this one has this one and that. We have to realize that we are going to have to do one or two things in this town. We are going to two things that got to happen in here, and this is one of the reasons why you have dropouts, Gary. The real reason you have dropouts in this city is because it is politically necessary for black people and Hispanic people to drop out. Because let's ask it this way. What would happen if you graduated 95% of black and Hispanic students in New York City? You know one of the things that basically would happen, given this economy, they wouldn't have any jobs. So it's easier to say they dropped out, they quiturated, or anything else, and therefore they're not working because of this, than to have them graduate, be prepared, and then to tell them they can't work. You see what I'm saying? And so often this dropout is a cover to cover a political situation. Yes.
Our guest is Dr. Amos Wilson. We're running just a couple of minutes over in the news, but stand by because I know that we have a number of people who are standing by to talk with Dr. Wilson. When we come back, we will move immediately into your telephone calls. Those of you who have been holding on, we certainly appreciate your patience. Stand by. I'm sure it'll be worth the wait. 1190 WLIB, World Leadership in Broadcasting. I'm Gary Bird. My guest this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson. Our topic this afternoon, educating black children according to their own psychology and psychological stereotyping and its effect on African people. We'll come back after this at 1190 WLIB, World Leadership in Broadcasting, the place where nobody does it better.
The Gary Bird Experience.
1190 WLIB Radio in the Key of Life on a Monday, May 9th, 1988. I'm Gary Bird. Our guest this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson, psychologist, author, professor, and entrepreneur at the Harlem Graphic Arts Center. Joining us this afternoon for the second part of our topic dealing with the education of black children according to their own psychology. And this afternoon, taking a look at the effects of psychological stereotyping on us as an African people. And taking your calls at 692-9542 and 1-800-332-1023. Without any further ado, we'll move right into your telephone calls. I again thank those of you who have been holding on quite patiently this afternoon. Go right ahead, please. You're in the air at WLIB. This is The Experience.
Good afternoon, Guy.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Okay, I'd just like to go back to that business of assimilation that you spoke about earlier on.
Yes.
If I read you correctly, I think that you were saying that one possible reason for those of us who choose to assimilate into the system rather than to confront it is rooted in some kind of a deep psychological trauma. You know, we would rather go ahead and marry our oppressors rather than to confront them. Could you just speak to that a little bit more?
Yes.
Thank you for the call.
Often it's sort of a if you can't beat them, join them kind of mentality, where people lose confidence in their ability to steer their own way or to control their own destinies, or where they've been imbued with a deep inferiority complex and self-alienation. And consequently, they want to overcome that through an identification process. Removing the color line is a part of that idea, you know, where the other people do not see you as different from themselves. Because many of us believe, consciously and unconsciously, that the reason why we are suffering is because we are black. You hear a lot of people say, you know, they did it to us because we're black. If this happened because, and this kind of approach implies that if I were not black, if I were not seen as black, then I wouldn't suffer this way. Then I wouldn't have to deal with the problems. And one of the shorthanded ways of doing it, of course, is by identifying with one's oppressor and trying to get one's oppressor in a state of mind such that he does not see you as different. If he doesn't see you as different, then he treats you as he treats himself. And therefore, if he see you and himself as one, that's what marriage is supposed to do, right? where the couple is to act as one. And so we're to assimilate with these people to the degree that they really don't see a difference. Then if they don't see a difference, there's no basis for discrimination. Discrimination is based on a perceived difference and acts on a perceived difference. And therefore, if we can identify with them closely enough, they would not perceive us as being different. They would not treat us as on the basis of difference. And we will then enjoy the advantages that they have, and we would escape our circumstances.
If you can add to that, perhaps your comment to me during the break, which may relate to this about over-determined.
I was you mentioned certain behaviors, and what I mean by over-determined is where a number of almost all of the systems operate to move you toward the same point. Last week I was talking about media, and I was talking about how the education system, of course, how the system is run on the basis of lies, and how the media will have to lie as well. The schools will have to lie and misconstrue as well. The criminal justice system must be unjust, and the economic system must keep you poor, and all of these kind of things. And so each one of them supports the other. So it's not one system that is moving you in a particular direction. It's a whole bunch of things. The whole atmosphere is suffused with messages that are pushing you in a particular direction. So it's overdetermined in that sense.
WLIB, good afternoon. You're in the air with our guest this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson. Go right ahead, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bird.
Thank you. Where are you calling us from this afternoon, by the way?
I'm calling from Manhattan.
Thank you.
And to Dr. Wilson, thank you very, very much. As usual, listening to WLIB, I find confirmation of my thoughts and my ideas.
Thank you.
Yesterday was Mother's Day, and I attempted to write, and I wanted to write something special for my mother who had passed. And I came up with this title for something that I had hoped to write, Psyche. Do you hear?
Yes, I got you.
And what you came and said was that the psychological stereotype was all those things that I have hoped and wanted to put to paper, and I will definitely listen longer. But my question to you, and I wish you could respond to it, it is, what is the psychological effect of the European theology to the people of color generally, but the African people particularly?
Right. Okay. Thank you for calling, and thanks for the compliments. As I said earlier, every institution in the system is geared toward one major thing, and that is maintaining the status quo. And the church and the religious system is no exception, as much as a lot of people would like to think it is being. As long as the church and the religious structure is defined by Europeans and defined within the European mode, it is going to function to maintain European power. And of course, we've had many references about that whole white Jesus bit and the whole the way theology is pitched and the writing blacks out of religion and being responsible for religion. And of course, all of those things are set up to maintain the system. The white Jesus, of course, set up to make us think of white as being defined and somehow holier and destined to be greater than any other color on this earth. But the theology and the theological schools, which many of our ministers go to, have a subtle way of indoctrinating white values and orientations as such. Also, the way the church is defined. The black church is not only a large religious institution, but it is really a very large economic institution, but it doesn't perceive itself that way. It doesn't perceive itself as a very large or possibly large educational institution and cultural institution. And therefore, it assumes the restricted definition of Europeans. So while they follow that definition, they function, even when they love, still to maintain the status quo in the system itself.
Boy, I tell you, each comment generates, I think, more and more questions, and I think our telephones prove it. 692-9542, the nationwide toll-free number, 1-800-332-1023. I'm going to keep it moving for those of you who are standing by for you to respond.
Quick sentence, because I think it's very important that we understand the task that our youngsters, in other words, as I pointed out last week, and I won't take long, I just want to say that it's not enough, as I said, to prepare for jobs and social mobility. You got to prepare for the unthinkable, as we indicated. We got to prepare for a revolution. We got to prepare for the idea that things may change. We must recognize one thing, that assimilationism and integrationism generally tends to work quite well when there's enough to go around. But when economic circumstances change, attitudes change, and we must think as a people in terms of what would happen or what could possibly happen if the economic system collapses and falls apart. Where will we be as a people? And we must educate our children in those terms. But about New York City, I wanted to point out, again, because I want people to think and start in their discussions about education in terms of the functions of the dropping out of black students and how that serves the political function. And to recognize that if we graduated a high percentage of black and Hispanic students where they could successfully compete with other ethnic groups, you have a problem. And that problem is one that either the economic system of New York City must expand to such a degree that it can take in these additional graduates, or at least the country must provide opportunities so that these graduates can go out away from the city, or we must knock some of the other ethnic groups out of their positions. And again, we have to think of educating our children for these two possibilities. It may be that we have to educate them to be prepared to push others out.
Or to create their own, I guess.
Or to create a combination of both.
Yes, exactly.
Because this has been a part of the tradition of this country. So I'm not talking about something that's...
No, it's happened before. There's no question
definitely.
About that.
One group... and every group that has moved into power and influence in New York City basically has replaced other groups, as those groups have moved into other positions in other places. But when it comes our turn, it seems as if everybody sort of gets stuck in place.
26 minutes after the hour, 3 o'clock. My guest again, Dr. Amos Wilson at WLIB. I'm Gary Bird. This is Experience 3, the Great Black Expedition segment of our radio magazine. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Where are you calling us from?
I'm calling from Jamaica, Gary.
Thank you. Go right ahead, please.
I respect you and I respect Dr. Wilson.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gary, can I to a question for you and a question for Dr. Wilson?
Let me just say to you, probably it'd be very quickly just to get a question for him because there are just so many people calling. There's just not enough time.
Okay. Dr. Wilson, you spoke about the various ethnic groups that have taken over the vegetable stores and the newsstands. I suppose you mean the Koreans and the Indians and so on. I mean, the Indians from India. And and I look and I see that academically, for instance, I think the last Westinghouse academic achievement, whatever they're called, contests, something like 8 out of 10 were Orientals.
Right, I recall.
And who look different from the Europeans.
Right.
And their culture also certainly is not taught in the schools. And is there something that we can learn from the Koreans, from the Japanese, from the Chinese, from the Vietnamese, from the Indians, who have come to this country after we did?
Yes.
We were here before they were, and even the African Caribbeans seem to have moved ahead academically, economically, and I would suspect that since usually economics comes first and then political power comes after it as a result of it.
Yes.
What is it that we can learn from them that they have done that perhaps we can do?
Okay, good question. Thank you.
Very much. I think I might have indicated in the last program, I alluded to what I call deculturation. The removal or the depriving of African Americans of the African culture. And of course, we've talked about that in the context of slavery, because you remove that culture in order to create the servant mentality and to have people almost think of servitude as a natural slot for them in life. Another one of the functions, of course, of that is consumerism. There's an international division of labor in the world. And the position for African people is that of producers of raw materials and as consumers. And to be the ultimate consumer, you almost have to have a polyglot of tastes. Because one thing culture does is to also define your taste, and to define your values, and to define your orientations. And that has an effect on the way you spend money. And consequently, if you want to make a person a consummate consumer, you make consumption becomes his defining activity, not his culture. And therefore, anybody who has a culture can come and sell that kind of person anything. because their culture is created by fads and styles and things of this nature, not by an enduring sense of themselves. So what you have then is people with a culture, people with a sense of culture, people with a sense of peopleness coming into our deculturized community to a great extent, and of course exploiting that community because of its very deculturized nature. I have also indicated that we support aliens because we have been alienated from ourselves. When we are separated from ourselves as African people, there is a gulf created in our personality, an emptiness created in our personality, a lack of identity created in our personality. That gulf, that emptiness, that void motivates us to fill it. And that void is filled in then by those stereotypes that we talked about earlier. And those stereotypes take on a life. They have an appetite. The stereotype has desires. And those stereotypes from ourselves, when we are separated from ourselves as African people, there is a gulf created in our personality, an emptiness created in our personality, a lack of identity created in our personality. That gulf, that emptiness, that void motivates us to fill it. And that void is filled in then by those stereotypes that we talked about earlier. And those stereotypes take on a life. They have an appetite. The stereotype has desires. And those stereotypes then literally take over our bodies, possess our bodies, and move us toward the support of their creators. You see, once the white removes you from your African identity, you still have a need to be identified. Now then, what he does then is to create the image of the nigger. Okay? And since he's in control of information and we see him as an authority figure and he's rewritten history and redefined the social system, often many of us then believe the lies, you see, and we assume the definition. And when you assume a definition, when you believe a lie, let me just illustrate it like this. You have to be given a description of a God before you can feel that God. And when you get that description, you can undertake the characteristics, you see. When these people stereotype us and we begin to believe the stereotype is not just a system of ideas. The stereotypes actually becomes a body experience and a behavioral orientation. And therefore the lies that we believe, those lies take on a personality in us and become, in a sense, our personality.
Or our culture.
Yes. And those lies as personality are under the direction of their creators. And therefore they will move our behavior toward those creators to maintain those creators as such. The solution then to this kind of problem is the rediscovery and re-identification with our African culture and with our African identity as a people, and to recognize that we have a right to protect our interests. I was speaking with someone here the other night about the raising of money, and we were talking about the system, the Susu system, and other African systems that we as African Americans have lost to a very great extent. And therefore, we have a great problem raising money for our businesses and so forth. You see, it's not enough just to have money. An economic system is based upon a set of social relations. It's the social relations that come first, even prior to the money. You see, and so while we have the money, we don't have the requisite social relations, and those social relations are defined by culture that makes us able to use that money for our interest. We look at the scandal of us taking all of our millions of dollars to these white banks, and these banks will not give a business such as my own a loan. And yet my people just lay the money into these banks. And these same banks use the money that black people put in them to build highways so that these jobs in the inner city can be transported out to New Jersey or somewhere where they can't even get to it. We finance the devastation of New York City because we have not learned that we have to build another kind of banking system, an informal banking system among us as a people, so that we can use the money for our own advancement. But that can only be done when you have a sense of peoplehood, a sense of culture, and a sense of identity, which other people have, and they have not lost, even when they immigrate into this country, and they use it to exploit us who don't have that kind of sense.
We are going to take a break for news headlines in the half hour, and there is more to come with Dr. Amos Wilson. Dr. Wilson, what is your time like this afternoon?
I haven't.
Okay, I'm going to take a very quick break, as I mentioned, and we'll also take a look to see about extending our time this afternoon with our guests, because by way of the telephone calls and certainly the information that's coming across, I think it certainly would be expedient for us to do that. So please stand by. We'll come back and move right away into your telephone calls at WIB with Dr. Amos Wilson. I'm Gary Bird. There's more to come in this afternoon's Experience.
The Gary Bird Experience.
It's 3:41 at WIB Radio in the Key of Life, and I'm Gary Bird. You're inside of the GBE. It is a beautiful Monday, May 9th, 1988. Great weekend, first day of the week, looking real good. I understand we'll have some rain a day or so from now. That's the bad news, but the good news this afternoon is that my guest, Dr. Amos Wilson, will be able to be with us for an extended period this afternoon, and I made that move in light of what certainly feels to be a very important vibration that is happening in the air, and certainly some very, very important information for us to arm ourselves with as we move towards the 21st century. So Dr. Amos Wilson will be with us extended past 4 o'clock this afternoon in order to take care of the many telephone calls and certainly to give him the opportunity to sort of expound as is necessary on the points that are raised this afternoon. WIB, I'm Gary Bird. Let's move into your telephone calls. Please let us know where you're calling us from first of all this afternoon inside of the Experience, and make it a point to keep your radio turned all the way down and keep your ear to the phone. Go right ahead, please. You're in the Experience.
Good afternoon, Gary.
Thank you.
First-time caller. I've listened to your program very often.
Great.
It's always excellent.
Thank you, brother. Where are you calling us from?
I'm calling from White Plains.
Great. Thank you.
The doctor?
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Wilson, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I purchased your book some time ago, and
Thank
of
you.
course it's one of the foremost books that I've written. I've read, pardon me. It
Thank
seems
you.
as if I've written it because it coincides with so much that I actually believe in and try to practice. My question is directed to first I'll make a brief remark, and I'll be brief. 5 cents, please.
Oh, okay. That caller's in a payphone, so we'll let him get that together for just a moment. 3:43, 17 minutes before 4 o'clock.
Gary?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, yeah. The remark is just this, that we as a people, we seem to be so outwardly directed that a lot of things that we seem to seek validation from other people,
Yeah.
we have a tendency of trying to be accommodationist and integrationist. It seems as if our reality is being defined for us instead of defined by ourselves. And I'd like the doctor to just briefly tell us how does that being outwardly directed hinder our progress, and also does he find that nations have that characteristic also of being either outwardly directed or inwardly directed, as I believe some Oriental groups seem to be?
Yes. Okay. Thank you for your call.
Thank you.
Certainly one of the processes that happens to the psyche of African people under oppression is what I call the externalization of the personality. In order for us to be controlled by other people, particularly psychologically controlled, we have to be what I call externalized and reactive, you see, so that our basic behavior is not a behavior motivated by internal drives and internal determinations, but by the need for external acceptance, the need, as he indicates, for external approval, the fear of being rejected by people outside of ourselves, and the sense that we are nobody until those people accept us and recognize us, a feeling of invisibility until we are seen by our oppressors. And when we let another people define reality for us and define us as persons, then naturally they will define us in such a way that it will make us reactive to them. You can see this operating on many different levels. He mentions the sense of nations. To a good extent, colonialized nations are externalized nations economically. You see even their basic economic infrastructure, such as their railroads or their highways, were built not to build a network within the nation itself, but were basically constructed so that their raw materials could be taken to the port cities and exported. So the construction of the railroad lines and construction of highways and so forth were not constructive in a way that was conducive to the growth and development of those societies. So you have a situation often where a certain segment of, say, an African nation may be literally cut off from its own marketplace by the way the highway and other systems have been designed, because they've been designed to meet external needs. And when we even talk about foreign aid, infrastructural aid, often if that foreign aid is used to build an infrastructural system, it's still built in a way to serve the interests of people outside. And then when you hire people to direct such an economic system, the local bourgeoisie that's going to direct their system will be externalized too, because it serves as the comprador group or the between group that mediates the exploitation of the nation with the metropoles. And they are going to get their cues and so forth from the outside as well. And if they're in charge of the education of their children and so forth, they of course create in their own image an externally oriented children. In order for us to fall under the control of the other people, we have to be externalized. And a part of that externalization process is deculturation. You see, because culture and a sense of culture and identity gives you a set of purposes and goals and directions in which to move. But if you don't have that deep sense of culture and people identity and sense of peoplehood, then you're going to have to get your control from outside on a reactionary basis.
So in essence, then you cannot be truly inwardly directed, right, without that sense of culture that you're describing.
Yes, that sense of identity, a solid sense of self. Otherwise, it's a reactive orientation.
1190 WLIB, Radio in the Key of Life. Well, wait a minute, though. If that's the basic understanding, then that says that is the basic state of mind that we, generally speaking, are operating in as a people in this society.
Yes, very much so. Two things happen. Those who essentially are deculturated, and, of course, which is a major reason why we have a dropping out in these schools, and a major reason why some of our children are not progressing academically the way they should, you see, because of that loss of people. Then you have another group that appropriates an alien culture, you see. So there are some of us who identify with the European culture and kind of take it over, and we can progress on, quote-unquote, on those values, you see. But the situation is, what we're going to do with that alien identity, even though we may make it to be the CEO of AT&T and all that, it means that we're just, the output of our labors will still go to the other people.
What happens in the rare case of the person who is able to move through the phases that we're describing in the quote-unquote upwardly mobile model, and yet who in arriving at that peak somehow does maintain a sense of his or her Africanness at that position? What's at work in that individual?
Well, there are a number of people like that. As a matter of fact, when I talk about the education of black children, I also have that as a dimension. Those who, with a sense of consciousness, can move into the system as an intelligence operation, as secret agents, and in an extreme sense, sometimes where they may be superficially even identified as being with the other people in order to attain the kind of information, knowledge, or technology, or whatever else we may need as a group. It's a very tight line between, working, because the system has some things we could use. Okay?
Yeah.
So the idea is, how do you educate some of us such that we can work with it smoothly and yet at not at the same time lose our identity to it? and use it as sort of like a mold in the sense of using it and transferring out of it those things that are of value. Because, right now we are the most valued employees in this country. And one of the reasons why we are valued, because we don't have that strong sense of peoplehood and the Pan-African connectedness. Too many employers don't have to worry about us shipping that information out to some other country or making some kind of connection. We can work in gun factories, as many of us do, and yet not ship weapons to South Africa so that our people can engage in war. When you deculturize the people, they make this kind of employee. They'll die with tremendous amounts of knowledge and information in their heads. I was having the discussion the other day when we were discussing investments of the many of us who sit in positions, but because we are isolated and cut off from one another, we can't give each other vital information and input so that we can use the system to our advantage. Part of the education of our children is to educate them in this way.
1190 WLIB, Radio in the Key of Life. Our guest this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson of The Experience. I'm Gary Bird. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from the village of Harlem.
Thank you. You're in the air with our guest. Go right ahead, please, Dr. Amos Wilson.
Yes. Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you.
I want to, and also Gary Bird, Dr. Amos Wilson, I definitely want to thank you so much because you have been a mentor for me. We were in your office and you spoke to my son in depth. And because of that, in the mentorship, since your book was published since 1978, I have utilized your book in my teaching methods in my classrooms. And you are so correct because people will ask you, well, what do you teach? And I say, everyone. and I say, and my mentor is Amos Wilson. And if they are not familiar with him, I carry copies of your books around with me, you see?
Thank you.
And in addition to that, I am quite distraught. I'm taking a leave of absence from the educational system, and I am available. At this point, I've recruited adults and young people to go to Africa for this summer. They must see exactly what you are speaking of about the lack of culturation that we possess. And as you well know, when I spoke to you, my son has had that exposure. And I cannot stand in front of a classroom and speak on what we need if, in fact, I have problems with my own child. So I had to work with him when he was born until this contributed to you. So I really have honors for you because of the way he is. So I'm available, and I would like to know what you can do about a situation who is of a teacher who's taking people abroad, because we're distraught over here. I'll hang up.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for the call.
Saturdays are my social days at my business, and from 9 to 5. Not this Saturday because I'll be in Philadelphia with the holistic conference down here. But generally, those are that's the day people come in, and I'm open to discussion there.
Let's give some information on where you are.
We're at the Print and Copy Center, Harlem Graphic Arts, but the store sign says the Print and Copy Center, and that's at 215 West 125th Street, right near 7th Avenue. I'd like to point out, though, quickly, too, because there's so much we need, because I did promise that we were going to talk a bit about some practical things in terms of education itself. And while we don't have time to go into today, I just want to mention a quick few things. And perhaps in the future I'll have a chance to do a forum on education.
Introduce some of it today, because we're going to go as long as you have this afternoon.
And, I just want to remind people again, principally, I'm trying to get across a mode of thinking about education. And I'm not going to write a prescription for it per se, because we can do that as a people. But one of the things we have to recognize is that every educational system is based, particularly if we're talking about a secondary school education, upon what we call the implicit child. What people perceive the child to be, what kind of characteristics the child will have at a certain age and certain time in its development. And it is either unconscious or conscious, you see. So we have to recognize that the current system under which New York City operates and across the country is based upon the white child's mental, social, psychological structure, and, of course, white children's goals. And therefore, it is important that we have a developmental psychology of the black child and know that developmental psychology, and then base the educational structure on that developmental psychology. A couple of calls back, there was a question about why the other people move in and can take over businesses. One of the reasons they can take over business is that many of us are so obsessed with our sense of inferiority, and so obsessed with our low status and our need to be loved and accepted and be seen as beautiful, and so obsessed with getting over our pain until our only concern is how much we can consume to overcome these very things. If I wear gold chains, that means, I'll be seen as hip and fresh and, up to date. If I rent an apartment that's overpriced, that means, I'll be loved and accepted, or I'll be seen as different from the regular round of Negroes in the streets, and these kind of things. People can become so obsessed with the need to be loved and the need to be accepted until academic functioning and intellectual functioning and development of culture can become very secondary to their lives. Those things, and so consequently, if black children are trying to deal with the kind of the crush that oppression has put on them, then we must recognize that as one of the personalities of black children. And that recognition means that some room in the curriculum must be made to address that problem, not haphazardly, not by accident or anything. That has to actually be built into the system if it is going to be. So the training of our children into peoplehood, since we recognize that peoplehood, a lack of peoplehood, at least, I won't say a lack of it, but, a deeper need for peoplehood is missing. That should be a part of the development of black children in schools as such. The lack of confidence is one of the things that keeps us from going into business. So many of us have fear of taking any kind of risk whatsoever. So many of us just have no guts. And so many of us are caught up in the immediate gratifications. If we go into business, we want to see a profit next week. We don't understand that business may involve a year or 2 or 3 or more of struggle and breaking even before one sees any kind of outcome as such. But for people who have lost a sense of future and have no connection with their past, they only get locked up in the present, and if they can't gain some immediate gratifications, then they won't do anything. But going into business requires a long-term outlook in something. Just one other thing. We have to recognize that the schools have to be continuous with the culture. You have to meet the child where he is. When you have a school based on another people's child or children, the school then is discontinuous with your own child, you see. So as the black child moves out of his home into the school, it's like almost moving into to foreign territory. There's not that smooth transition. So you move a black child who's speaking black English into a system that speaks quote-unquote standard English and demands that he speaks standard English almost immediately. You're going to create a contradictory experience in that school. We have to recognize, too, that if you're going to say that we've suffered from all the things that we talk about, enslavement, Jim Crowism, and the whole bit, we must recognize that these things have impacts on the way we think, on our motivation, the way we solve problems and approach problems. If our children, let us say this, are half as prepared, let us say, just to use a standard phrase, as a white child when he enters school or any level of schooling, you must recognize then that 2 things have to happen in that situation if you're going to equalize the education, to use that degraded term. Either that your child is going to have to learn twice as fast to catch up, or the time span has to be doubled. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. The very time system in these schools, how long a particular class is taught, is set up to defeat black children. You see what I'm saying? Because that time system is set up and based on another people's children. So the very structure itself has built-in failure in it, because the time that a child is in math, let us say, or the time your child is in science or in reading, is set up according to somebody else's standard who's undergone a whole different experience and have a different psychology. But when you buy this stupid idea about standard education, assuming that there's some universal time which children must be taught this and this and this, you're going to destroy your children. And that's what happens to us. So when we look at education, we must look at the very time system. We also must, if you're going to say standard English is necessary for our success in this society, you may then perhaps think of getting rid of French in the school system and using those hours that are taught, where the child is taught French for speaking English, since 99% of them will probably not go to France or will only go there for 2 or 3 weeks out of their lives. So we have to look at this system and say, what are we going to remove out of this system in order, and what are we going to put into it in order to meet the needs of our children?
We have news coming up at the top of the hour from 1190 WLIB. We come back, we'll get more into your telephone calls this afternoon with Dr. Amos Wilson, who is with us. Again, as I mentioned before, we are extending his time this afternoon, and we will make every attempt to get to all of your telephone calls, so all of you on hold, please stand by. We'll come back and move right away into your calls after news from the top inside of the GBE, the Gary Bird Experience, at 1190 WLIB, World Leadership in Broadcasting, the place where nobody does it better.
Experience.
It's 1190 WIB, Radio the Key of Life, and you're inside of the GBE at 7 minutes after the hour, 4 o'clock. And you know it's the heartbeat of the city, deep inside of you on this Monday afternoon, May 9th, 1988, live before 5. Inviting you to join us inside of our conversation this afternoon with Dr. Amos Wilson, psychologist, author, professor, and entrepreneur at the Harlem Graphic Arts Center. Our topic is educating blacks according to their own psychology. One of the things we've gotten into this afternoon, as privy from our last broadcast, is psychological stereotyping and its effect on African people. And we're taking your telephone calls at 692-9542 and 1-800-332-1023. Dr. Wilson, before we go to our telephone calls, I think you had a quick comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of list a couple other things that people should consider when we're talking about reorganizing the system. And the time thing is of great importance because, you know, a culture it also has a time dimension related to it. And you cannot ignore that time dimension and the sense of timing in a culture and not damage that culture. And we have to look at our culture and our children in terms of time and also translate that into the educational process. But much of the education of our children is irrelevant, and we really have to make the curriculum relevant to the kind of issues I raised earlier.
What do you mean when you say irrelevant?
In the sense that much of what our children are being taught in these schools is really not relevant to our advance as a people, and really unneeded as far as their own development as personalities are concerned. For instance, you take a civics course, and the civics course often does not tell the truth at all about the reality of city politics or the way businesses are run and communities are really run and developed. And students are miseducated in that area. And of course, we know they're miseducated in history. History should be taught in such a way that we get insight into ourselves and insight into other people in the world, and we are motivated to accomplish certain things. But this history just leaves us with a bunch of knowledge and information, often that's really of little, no value whatsoever. Let me point it out in another way. After many years, last week or so, I read Nathan Hurd's book, Howard Street. Now, some people would call that a ghetto novel, you know, and just a regular street novel. Mm-hmm. But I enjoyed reading it immensely. And I recognized something more deeply as I read it, how much more relevant the reading of that novel would be than the reading of Shakespeare and the reading of the standard so-called literature in these schools. Mm-hmm. Because that novel, of course, speaks to the reality of our people. It doesn't glorify ghetto life at all. It, though, permits, even when you're living in the ghetto, often you need to be able to step back from it, and a book permits you to step back from it and to see the trees and the forest, even though you're part of it. Mm-hmm. And it permits then our children to step back from it. What happens to the characters permits them to discuss their current behavior and future behavior. What's the outcome? It permits discussions of values and morality. It permits thinking to occur. It maintains an interest level such that the student may enjoy writing about it and talking about it in various ways, you see. And so actually you can develop thinking skills, communication skills, insight into oneself and into one's culture, a sense of consequences as what to happen to people when they get addicted to drugs, what happens to guys when they actually get caught up in the various things of the system. You get a look at the police, you get a look at other things by reading this kind of novel. And you come out of there then with a sense of who you are, what you are, a sense of culture, a sense of understanding yourself and other people. But you've also been engaged in dialogue. You've also learned how to think. You've also learned how to move beyond your immediate situation and circumstances, all of which is really what education should be about.
But now somebody's asking, isn't Shakespeare important? Dr. Wilson,
I don't think Shakespeare is important. Frankly speaking, there are many people in the world living quite well without any knowledge of Shakespeare at all. The language is archaic. It's not spoken. And a lot of time is wasted pondering over it. The philosophy, and there are great philosophical ideas in Shakespeare. I've read Shakespeare. I read Shakespeare, okay? I'm not saying that it shouldn't be read. I'm questioning the projecting of it into the system the way it's done. Not only does it make it appear that white culture is so high and the only high-flown ideas are contained in Shakespeare, there are high-flown ideas contained throughout black literature. Major philosophical concepts and moral and value issues are throughout black literature. So you don't have to read Shakespeare to get a sense of philosophy and the sense of the profound nature of man at all. And when I get tangled up in all of that language and all this other stuff, and with the implication that the only great literature in the world is Shakespeare and a European literature, you start killing children's minds and interest in reading when you put them into this kind of literature.
It's an interesting comment because a bit earlier today I heard Irving Berlin, who celebrates his 100th birthday or something, referred to as the greatest songwriter of our time. And when I heard it, I had to stop for a minute and I looked at the radio and I said, well, wait a minute. Was there ever some sort of vote taken in which, the entire known, society actually all voted and said there is no question about it? Now, that takes nothing away from the man, but the fact of the matter is that, there are these projections of importance, which is what you're referring to.
And this is what you get. The other thing you have to emphasize very much is vocabulary, word, knowledge. Our children, as I've said on other programs, are developed in advance of European children. They fall behind the European child at the point where language becomes the chief instrument for dealing with the world. And it is in the language area, the ability to use symbols and the ability to manipulate words and vocabulary that is of key importance. And a much larger area for linguistic development must be made in the education of black children. We are created by words. Words are physical. Words are real. They're not just sounds and means of communication. They're the means by which we words are our computer programming for our brains. And if you don't have certain words, you cannot appropriately organize your brain. If you don't have certain symbols, you cannot appropriately organize your brain. One of the reasons why many of the children have problems in math is because they cannot translate a linguistic concept into a mathematical operation. And that is why you, as we were talking off mic sometimes, you may spend the first few years in their linguistic development without engaging them in math. And build the linguistic system up so that when they move into math class, they can move in 1 year what it would take them under the other circumstances 2 or 3 years to accomplish. The other thing that must be made room for is, of course, thinking skills. We are robbed of our thinking skills because it is our thinking that is the greatest threat to the European society. And therefore, if you're going to educate black children, you must put a large percentage of time in on the development of thought and conceptual skills. Forget about what these whites are teaching their kids. You must recognize what is robbed of your children in order for this system to operate. Then you realize what you must teach them in order to get them back again. Thinking is very important. Social skills is another very, very important area. We don't have to explain what that is. Personality skills. Listening. So many of our people don't know how to listen actively and focus in terms of attention. Those things have to be built back in to the process before you get into the education of children. So I just wanted to mention a few of those things as points that we have to focus on as we reorganize education.
Let's move into our calls right now. Dr. Amos Wilson at WLIB. I'm Gary Bird. We're live before 5. Good afternoon. Where are you calling us from? Go right ahead, please. WLIB, where are you calling us from?
I'm calling from Brooklyn.
Thank you. What part of Brooklyn are you in, brother?
I'm in Bensonhurst.
Thank you. Go right ahead.
I think that it's dangerous what the doctor's doing. I think he's the cause of why we have so much poverty and poor schooling system, because they're teaching in the schools.
I am the cause.
Yeah,
isn't that rather?
Militants and the socialists.
Hold on for a minute, sir.
It's teaching them how to be militants and not to enter the economic system, and they're teaching them culture. And you can't teach somebody culture when he goes out to get a job. He has no job. There's not that many jobs for ballet dancers or militant soldiers. I think the purpose of the school system should be secular and separated of church and state, separation of politics, and separation of culture, which is going to try to bring in whatever culture this is going to be. It may teach the people how to not like white people. We shouldn't be using the school system as an apparatus to bring in political theories. And if they want to do that, they should set up separate private schools. This is the same problem we have with religion and politics, and the taxpayers have to finance this of how they're going to, who are they going to go against these soldiers that they want to train? I think it's
hold on to the call. I think you've made several points, and what I want you to do is this. You've put forward a particular response and a notion. What I want you to do is I want you to stay on the line, and I want you to listen. You know what you put forward. Dr. Wilson has listened. Let's give him the chance to respond, and let's see if we can basically come to some understanding.
Let me make something very clear to you. You are indulging in a very typical racist kind of thinking. And that kind of racist thinking is what we call blaming the victim. You have the nerve to blame me for the condition that my people are in. I shouldn't even dignify that with an answer. So the idea that I am the cause of the problem is really an asinine kind of statement. But that's the kind of asininity that we are faced with in this society, where these people who have raped and robbed our people blame us for being the cause of the problem. That is the kind of mentality that I want our children educated out of, and that's one of the reasons why I want this educational system changed, because it creates the kind of people that you apparently are, where your kind of thinking is backwards to a degree, where you make people who've been victimized by your system the cause of their own victimization as such.
This caller seems to have difficulty seeing the political structure of the educational system.
Any educational system is political. There is no such animal as a non-political system. That's another stupidity that is perpetrated on people. The idea that education is neutral and non-political in its nature. It's no social or cultural system that's going to set up an education system that is non-political. It's set up to maintain the culture in the first place. It's set up to maintain a group of people in control and in possession. The idea that you can produce a system, and it can be done, but it's not being done in this instance. This is one of the greatest lies that is perpetrated on black people, and that is that lie that the school is neutral, non-religious, non-political, and non-racial in its aspects. It is not such. When you are writing textbooks filled with lies about history, you're writing economics books filled with lies and untruths, you write cultural history that makes people believe that the world began with the Greeks, and you write a history that puts white Jesuses and other kind of people up front and make other people's literature and contribution to the world's civilization kneel and so forth. There's no way you can tell me that system is neutral and non-religious. This country calls itself a Christian nation, and it harks to Christianity, even while it pretends that its school is and its school systems are non-religious. But only a fool can believe that.
Okay, we lost that caller apparently at 1190 WIB. Hopefully he has something to ponder with him this afternoon. Go right ahead, please. You're in the experience with Dr. Amos Wilson. Go right ahead, please.
Being non-political is one of the most political things you can do. One of the most non-political things you can do is to let someone know your political viewpoint. Instead of trying to hide it behind a pretense of being non-political.
Go right ahead, please. You're in the air live before 5.
Hello.
Hi, good afternoon. Where are you calling us from?
Yes, I was born in the Caribbean, and this system is very prevalent in the island I was born in. The system where, like someone who have heavy African features as far as being very dark brown to black in complexion, who did not lose the Africanness or African features through the slavery trip, will be treated as how the whites will treat them by someone of light-skinned complexion, and is broken up in that island so that the dark-skinned people, the African people-looking people, will get the worst jobs, while the light-skinned or the mulatto will be on top and live in certain areas where you have the best houses, the best jobs, get more different care than the dark complexion people. And I noticed that also goes on in this country. And he spoke about how someone who is black would marry a white to feel as one with the white. But also the offspring of that couple will turn around and do to the blacks, especially those of dark complexion, the dark-skinned blacks I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. They will treat them the same way, similar how a white will treat a black person. Right. So as a dark-skinned black man, I do not feel only racism coming from the white community, I also get it from the mulatto or the so-called light-skinned black.
Your response, Dr. Wilson, to this?
Okay, then I can understand. We have to recognize that there's a world color hierarchy that moves, of course, from white, blonde, blue-eyed down to very, very dark black. And people are ordered on those ranks, and it will be that way as long as whites are the dominating group in the system. And of course, as I said earlier, many people try to identify with that other group as a way of escaping themselves. You know, it used to be that there were blacks who used to talk about lifting up the race. And a part of that lifting up the race, of course, was to lighten their children. But we see that that's been a problem for a couple of thousand years. You read Chancellor Williams' book, and he starts it out with this very issue that's being raised today. And I mentioned earlier about the trying to escape our victimization by identifying with the aggressor. And many of us then, when we treat each other the way we are treated, we unconsciously identify with the aggressor at that point. When we call another black person by, the degrading name, for that moment, we are separating ourselves from that person, and we assume then that we belong to some other group other than the person who we're, using that assignation in relationship to. So many of us then will behave toward ourselves the way other people behave because of the unconscious need to identify with the other people and the need to get a sense that we are different. The ultimate point of racism, and for racism to really work well, it must involve the internalization of racism. I've often said it is not what whites have said about us. It's not their scandalization of the African personality, and it's not all of the miserable things and things that they've done and said to us. The main problem is the way we reacted to those things. It's not the lies that they have told, it's our believing of the lies. And once you believe the lies, and once you let people get you to believe the scandals that they've made about you, then you become a participant in the very process. You then become self-degrading. You then become degrading to other people like yourself. And really the thing that we must struggle against more than anything else, even against white racism, is internalized racism. Because it is through internalized racism that we actually participate in our own oppression. And when you talk about situations in the Caribbean and in other places that you mentioned, it is a result of the internalization of racism and therefore the recruiting of oppressed people to maintain their own oppression, which is the reason why you've got to re-identify with your African selves so as to not internalize the racism, and consequently you will not then be engaged in a self-destructive behavior.
1190 WLIB, you're in the air with Dr. Amos Wilson, live before 5. I'm Gary Bird, a special extended version of our broadcast. The topic, educating our children according to their own psychology this afternoon, and we're giving you the chance to join us at 692-9542 and 1-800-332-1023. Go right ahead, please.
Yes, by teaching linguistic skills, do you mean word development? And by that, do you mean teaching our children to read early. Because if, as it is as you say, that our children start to fall behind when they enter school, we're talking about 5 and 6 years old. So then that would mean to me that we would have to begin teaching our children how to read at age 3 and 4. Do you agree with that?
I very much agree with that. In fact, the falling behind process really begins around age 2. It doesn't become as apparent until maybe around about grade 5, but already the slippage has occurred. And
grade 5 or age 5?
Around grade 5.
Grade 5?
Yeah. You begin to see it. And, of course, as the child moves up into the school system, words and word power become more and more important. And then you see then by grade 6, 7, and 8, the lack of the word power begins to tell. And this is, of course, where you begin to have the dropouts and the frustration with schools and so forth. The need to understand words in terms of meaning and their manipulation, prefixes, suffixes, approaching words in terms of phonics is a key importance. There's no society that doesn't speak a language, which means that language is inherently important to man. It's not a happenstance. And when you then impair language, you're impairing something very vital about human beings. You know, and so we have to look at language and its effect on our children.
1190 WLIB. You're in the air with Dr. Amos Wilson and The Experience. Go right ahead, please.
Good afternoon, Brother Gary. How are you?
I'm fine, brother. Good afternoon.
And good afternoon, Brother Amos.
Good afternoon. Great to hear you.
You were talking about culture. When you go to a doctor, he takes a blood culture. And he takes other cultures from you to find out what's going on inside of you. So if one has been vacuum cleaned of their culture, that means that they are dead. Now, I would think that what you are saying with respect to our children being educated is going to be somewhat of a difficult process because the parents themselves are the ones who are promoting now this concept of education for education's sake, but they don't see often that the results of that is only a dead-end street. You had mentioned the fact that when things get scarce, people tend to Good afternoon, Brother Gary. How are you?
I'm fine, brother. Good afternoon.
And good afternoon, Brother Amos.
Good afternoon. Great to hear you.
You were talking about culture. When you go to a doctor, he takes a blood culture. And he takes other cultures from you to find out what's going on inside of you. So if one has been vacuum cleaned of their culture, that means that they are dead. Now, I would think that what you are saying with respect to our children being educated is going to be somewhat of a difficult process because the parents themselves are the ones who are promoting now this concept of education for education's sake, but they don't see often that the results of that is only a dead-end street. You had mentioned the fact that when things get scarce, people tend to disregard people who are not empowered and not in their group.
Right.
So it would seem to me that along with telling us about how these things work, the plan that we must have for education is one that forces the parents either to teach their own children or to give their children away and let other people teach them with the recognition that those children would never carry out anything cultural because nobody else teaches another person their culture. Thus, I would think that you might want to recommend that as black people, African people seriously care about their children's education, they would take the children out of the school and educate the children their own selves. And that way they won't expose them to the death dealing devastation that goes on in education. But I seriously believe also that the parents are the people who are offering their children to this death. And when the child rebels against the educational system, they are trying to save their lives while their parents are trying to push them into it.
Dr. Wilson,
yes.
Very interesting paradox.
Yes, it is. In fact, that's one of the paradoxes you have of dropoutism sometimes, that the child recognizes often he's been alienated and split from himself, that something unreal is happening. And unfortunately, he resists that transformation by getting out of those systems or disrupting it or resisting it sometimes in a way that may lead him into even worse situations. And I agree with him very fully that often this is, too, what has happened. The child recognizes that something is terribly wrong with what's happening to me in the system. And therefore, I don't want to be a part of it. But then without an alternative educational system or alternative set of priorities, they often lead right into some other kind of predicament. When we talk about the education of black children, again, one of the things we must talk about as black people is parent education, you see. To what extent should the schools be responsible to open themselves up to the education of parents, and to what extent can we get our schools to actively involve parents? Because it is very clear in terms of the research literature, where parents are involved in the education of their children intimately, the children do better and achieve better in schools. We're not going to get these schools at this point, at least, to educate our children culturally. But as I said on the previous program, I think the cultural education of our children should take place outside of schools anyway. We're not going to let other people be responsible for this. So the most important segments of our education, that is peoplehood education, the peoplehood education into the appropriate human relations we have with one another, education in terms of our social goals and other kind of goals, really should occur outside of the school structure.
Does that indicate, Dr. Wilson?
And so that when the children go into the schools, they get out of those schools things that support the goals they already have.
What does that indicate about parents who are, for whatever reasons, sending their children to public schools or to schools that basically do have a Eurocentric base? What are they going to experience if they're doing the outside teaching that you're talking
They're
about?
going to have to, given this, the way that things are set up now, that has to be counteracted by the extracurricular activities. And so, while we can't, it's rough to ask us to withdraw the children out of school, and it's unrealistic at this point to withdraw children from public schools. In fact, we should be thinking about taking over the public schools anyway. But the other thing is, there are other ways they can develop in terms of their sense of culture. Even if you demanded, even within those Eurocentric schools, that those children learn how to think and learn how to reason and learn how to analyze in a fresh and original sense of the word, there is still a foundation for them to break loose and free from that system if they maintain some kind of contact with the African community. I was educated in the Eurocentric system, okay, but I managed, and I went through college singing Palestrina and European songs. I was a part of the Glee Club, and we held the black songs until the end of the program. 3 or 4 little songs, and of course I read much French history and Greek and all that other kind of stuff.
Well, what turned you around?
But I lived in a black community. And I lived around some very good black people. And I admired some great black teachers and principals and presidents and so forth. And therefore, that counterbalanced my being taken over completely. And luckily, my wonderment, my ability to wonder, my ability to be curious, and my ability to question what is going on in the world, and my confidence in my ability to think and arrive at my own answers were not destroyed. And so when I came to New York City and other places where I was exposed to Michelle's bookstore, and I was exposed to these guys on the corner, it just clicked in place. I was already set because I came through a beautiful black experience in my early childhood. The other knowledge fell right in place. because I had the openness to take it in.
1190 is WLIB. You're getting a chance to take it in this afternoon, our special extended broadcast this afternoon with Dr. Amos Wilson. We're taking your telephone calls at 692-9542 and the nationwide toll-free number 1-800-332-1023. Our topic this afternoon is certainly a critical one, educating black children according to the psychology of themselves. This afternoon, our guest is also elaborating a bit on some of the psychological stereotyping and its effect on African people. We'll come back to give you the chance to continue in our conversation with Dr. Amos Wilson. Those of you listening in your cars, I am sure that you are enjoying yourselves this afternoon. You may certainly look forward to another visit from Dr. Wilson when you'll be able to talk with him as well. And we'll also have the telephone number for the Harlem Graphic Arts Center coming up in the next half hour, and location for those of you who'd like to network with Dr. Wilson. So stand by. There's more to come this afternoon's GB Experience. I'm Gary Bird. Back with more after this.
Bird Experience.
1190 WLIB Radio McKee of Life, and I'm Gary Bird. You're inside of the GBE as we move into our final 18 minutes this afternoon with our guest, Dr. Amos Wilson. He's very kindly extended his broadcast with us this afternoon inside of the GBE to take your telephone calls on this Monday, May 9th, 1988. As I mentioned before towards the top of the broadcast, Dr. Wilson is a psychologist, author, professor, and entrepreneur at the Harlem Graphic Arts Center. He is the well-known author of the Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, which was published in 1978 by Africana Research Publications in Harlem. He takes, as you can clearly hear this afternoon, a radical view towards redefining the educational process in order to educate our children according to their own psychology. We're taking your calls this afternoon for Dr. Wilson at WIB inside of the GBE, the Gary Bird Experience. We move right away into your calls right now. I'm going to ask those of you who are calling to keep your questions as brief as you can so that we can try to get to every caller. That's a promise that we're going to try to keep this afternoon. Go right ahead, please. Good afternoon. You're in the air.
Yes, good afternoon. The reason I'm calling is I just recently heard of Dr. Wilson's book, and I'm glad you have him on the air right now. And I'm a psychology major at Fordham University, and I'll be interested in hearing what, when I graduate, I'll be graduating next May, and I'd like to get into the field of, something to where I can help more, my people and I guess everyone in general. But I'd like to know, basically, I need help on how to go about getting into the area that Dr. Amos is in, because I do agree with him, that there's a lot of things within the education system that we need to change in order to enhance the education for black people.
Thank you. I take, as a psychologist, of course, I take a special interest in students who are majoring in psychology, and I urge you and those black students who are in psychology to come by on Saturdays and speak with me, because I try to maintain this a kind of mentor relationship with students who are interested in psychology. So if you'll drop by one Saturday afternoon or morning and speak to me directly, I'd be very happy to be of whatever assistance I can to you in orienting you in terms of your psychology.
To the caller, thank you for being with us this afternoon at WLIB. Go right ahead, please. You're in the experience. Dr. Wilson, this caller just broke away from us, but let's make it a point, since that caller just posed that question, to give your telephone number and location for those who are listening as well.
Okay, it's the Print and Copy Center, 215 West 125th Street, and the number there is 316-3280. Weekends are the best.
Again, 212-316-3280. WIB, Radio on the Key of Life. Thanks for joining us. Hello, go right ahead, please. WIB, make sure you stay to your phone because you're going to lose your opportunity. Go right ahead, please. You're in the air. Hello, you're in the air. Go right ahead.
Hello, I'm just Mac Layman. I would like to ask that I respect both of you. I'd like to ask the doctor a question. Why there's so many African Americans, even on television, and mayors would denounce that say the country is not ready for an African president. And I would like to, it seems like I can't understand that, I feel like you have to make the country ready. And that's one of the questions that I like to ask. The other one is towards the gentleman that called, I said about the mulatto kids being prejudiced against him. That racism is taught. You're not born with racism, because I have a mulatto kid, He's been to Africa, he's been to the Caribbean, and he's more so-called African-American than some of these kids that are around in my neighborhood. So, but I don't want to judge people as far as... So those are the two questions I'd like to ask the doctor.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I don't think the caller implied necessarily that mulatto kids are born in that way. If I can recall, certainly I agree with the caller that this is a taught situation. And we're all, whether mulatto, black, caught up in the contradictions that racism puts us in. And, of course, some people will react very strongly in one direction and in others under those circumstances. I don't quite, I can't, of course, explain why other people sometimes say that the country's not ready for a black president. I have my opinions about it. I think it's in the same vein of saying often that this country and the world is not ready, as far as they're concerned, to accede to the leadership of black men and women and of black people in general, or to accede to us positions of high regard and respect and influence in the society, because they feel that often letting us have those positions may mean a denial to them of some of the advantages that they now have. When you hear many of the callers who take that tact, they often talk about what Jesse Jackson is going to take away from them. That is, when I listen to some of the white callers and what they're going to lose as a result of Jesse Jackson or some other black person being in the position. And, of course, these people believe their own racist philosophy as well. When they have come to believe that the black man cannot as intelligently lead the world or this nation as any other people on earth, then, of course, they fear putting us in that position. So what I think underlies this kind of statement is actually a fear that if black people were put in this position, they would lose their advantages. I just want to say something right quick, by the way, going back to some previous callers and also to talk to some people. There is a belief here among many people that to be pro-black is to be anti-white in essence, and we have to deal with that and look at that. We are caught into this psychological game that any other people can celebrate themselves, can celebrate their culture, can be about themselves, and not be perceived as anti-American and so forth. But as soon as black people celebrate their African heritage and their culture and so forth, some people immediately see that as being anti-this or anti-that, or see it as some indication of hatred for another people. I am not here to talk about hating another people, because hatred of another people has its problems too, you see, and a good reason why many of our people are in the shape that they're in, they've made themselves hate in the wrong kind of way. And hatred is a very destructive emotion. Now, I'm not talking about hating people. I am talking about love of self and being of self. And the other thing I want to speak to, there is this idea that if you talk about blackness, you somehow are restricting yourself. Don't forget the whites are only 10% of the world's population. They're going to soon be 5% of the world's population. How can you look at those people as representing something more universal than black people? And the idea then is if you talk about blacks who are a large percentage of this world, you somehow are restricting your vision and you're not covering universal topics or topics of universal value. That is nonsense. To talk about the people of color in this world is to talk about the vast majority of people, and it's certainly more universal than to talk about blacks. And I tell you, when I talk about psychology from the black point of view, my students learn as much about, quote-unquote, the standard psychology and about themselves as any other group of people. As a matter of fact, if they listen to me well, they'll know more psychology than a white student will know about white psychology.
WLIBU Radio, the Key of Life. You're inside of the GBE Live Before 5. I'm Gary Bird. Thanks for joining us in the experience. We've got about 10 minutes before 5 o'clock. That is 10 before 5. I know most of you, of course, at work are going to be going home in about another 10 minutes, but I do advise you to keep your radios on, and those of you who are at home relaxing with them or perhaps taking notes, you're certainly on the case, and I applaud you this afternoon for spending your time with us. Go right ahead, please. You're in the experience.
Yes, hi. I'm calling in to speak to the doctor.
You're
I
with
agree
him.
with everything that he's saying.
Thank you.
I've experienced it, and what the the psychological warfare that is being raised amongst black people is that for us to defeat our own purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to the school system, I've been there. My daughter, I taught her to read when she was about 2. The school system did not like that.
No, they usually don't.
They said, you're confusing the child. Please don't teach her at home. At the age of 4, they wanted me to give her a test. I said, okay, you could test her in front of me. They did. She had 120 IQ. Oh, that's enough for her to go through life. She is brilliant. I said, but that's not good enough for me. After that, she went to kindergarten, 1st grade. They wanted to test her. They said she had a behavioral problem. I said, oh, no, I don't think she has a behavioral problem. I think the problem lies with you. They tested her. They called me into the school system. Oh, Mrs. Hall, we want to know what you did to your child. You should be teaching in the system. I said, I did what they told me not to do. I taught her at home. And the system is that as black people, we should have an inferiority complex. When they find out you don't have an inferiority complex, then you have a problem.
Yes.
And we have to fight this, and we have to fight it and be alert. The main thing is parents have to be alert. There is no such thing as because you're black, you're inferior.
No.
We are supposed to think of ourselves as super. There is no reason why we have to keep ourselves down. Jesse Jackson will be president. There's nothing wrong with it. People have to get over the slave mentality.
Definitely.
And once we get over the slave mentality, then we'll rise above everything else, all obstacles.
Thank you very much for your comments.
1190 WLIB. Let's go to our nationwide toll-free line at 1-800-332-1023. Good afternoon. Where are you calling us from?
I'm calling from East Orange, New Jersey.
Go right ahead, please.
Okay. What I wanted to talk to you about was I agree with everything that Brother Wilson is saying, right?
Thank you.
And then there was something else earlier today that you were talking about bringing, can I just tell my radio down 1 second, please?
Okay, please do. Again, we got about 7 minutes before the hour 5 o'clock. We have been joined by a host of other callers. We're going to, again, do our best to move through all of them as quickly as possible.
Okay, remember earlier when you said the question was people bringing in guns into the school?
Yes,
and how you tied it to him. What I had thought that was really, I agree, bringing the guns in the school are bad, but like Mr. Wilson might say, if he was to say, it's the bombs and the booby traps waiting for you when you get in school that are bad. And another lady called about the Chinese. What she didn't realize, I had read that what the Chinese do is when they go to school during the week here, 2 days in the weekend, they go to a little Chinese school where they put on their clothes and everything to keep their culture going. And I think that personally, like when we have our schools and education things, we should go on the weekends to our places and put on our African wardrobes. Have our speakers come down and talk to us and look like Africans instead of looking like black Europeans.
Definitely. Great.
Thank you for your call. WLIB Radio on the Key of Life. Thank you for joining us. You're live before 5 with Dr. Amos Wilson. Go right ahead, please.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. How are you?
Thank you. We're fine, brother.
Dr. Wilson?
Yes, sir.
I just want to thank Allah for sending you to have the courage to stand up and speak the truth.
Thank you.
You know, because the status quo don't like you when you speak the truth.
Yeah,
I'm calling from Newark, New Jersey. Gary, I love you.
Thank you, brother.
What I want to say is that my son is 8 years old. I've been very fortunate in the fact that he's only attended private school, started by Imam Baraka. And my son his whole education is built on his African awareness. I mean, he gets the English and the mathematics and the science, but he gets it from an Afrocentric perspective, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
He can speak some of the Swahili. He can speak the Arabic language. He is a straight-A student. If you ask him who Dr. Sam Njomo or Oliver Tambo or Nelson Mandela or Malcolm X or Dr. King or any of these people, he can tell you right away who they are. And I just want to say that for the radio listeners that are listening, particularly the African Americans, if we don't stand up and stop being a bunch of scared to death Negroes to face the truth, we're going to always be the laughing stock of the world. And I want to say to the Caucasian listening audience, don't fear what you're hearing. You have nothing to fear but fear itself. All we're trying to do is get a piece of this American pie and head off a disaster. And I just want to say I love you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your call, brother.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, and you mentioned the son, and of course, and the accomplishments, which are fantastic. I just want to use that statement to indicate one of the most important things in the education of our children is, of course, high expectations of our children. As indicated in my book, our children are second to none in their learning capacity. And when you have this belief or this unconscious or semi-conscious idea that they can't learn as much or more than other people, that becomes self-defeating. And that's one of the things we have to do, too, when we approach schools. We have to look at them in terms of their level of expectation of the children, because the level of expectation of the children subtly determines what is being taught, how they're taught, determines body language, and a whole lot of other things that ultimately creates the children one expects them to be. In other words, we talk about that self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't expect our children to learn as well or better than other children, they won't, because you'll make sure they don't.
1190 WLIB, Radio on the Key of Life. We're moving through our last 4 calls, which are on hold. I think we'll try to get to all of them. Again, keep your comments as brief as you can for those of you who are calling so that we can move through all 3 telephone callers who've been patiently waiting. Go right ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be able to get through at least in the last 4 calls. It's difficult to say anything that hasn't been said already, especially considering the fact that Dr. Wilson just stated. I forgot exactly what my point was in regards to that particular point, but he just stated some of the points that I was holding on to speak on. When we talk about that caller, not when we talk about that caller, when we speak on the situation and that caller calls in from Bensonhurst, it's important for him to realize that Christopher Columbus did not discover America, but it's taught in the schools. There must be some agenda there that relates to that. That's not an anti-Italian sentiment, but it's the truth. He could not discover a place where people already lived. The point that I was relating to a little while earlier was about being pro-black and not being anti-white. And people do have a problem relating to that particular situation. Anytime we deal with ourselves on an up and up and push ourselves forward, it is a threatening situation for the people who are trying to create and maintain the status quo. And we do, and yes, we are not saying that we do not want to set up our own schools and teach our own children, but in fact in the public school system, there has to be a situation set up where, yes, through the so-called equality of the system, allows us to be able to project for our children positive images, and in fact allow them to be able to take projects to that school that reflect their positive, that reflect their great history, and that will not be downgraded by teachers who are, not to say racist, but prejudiced themselves.
Right. Thank you.
1190 WLIB to the caller. We're just moving on in the interest of time to get to the last few callers. Go right ahead, please, very quickly.
Hello?
Yes, you're in the air.
Okay. I'm just calling because I wanted to find out from Dr. Wilson. I started an African Heritage program in my son's daycare center, and I got a lot of negative response from the teachers. I got the best positive response from the children, but the teachers felt that we were putting too much in these kids by teaching them about Africa. Now, I'm asking Dr. Wilson, what can we do as parents in the school system that when we come up against teachers, black African-American teachers that don't feel that Shakespeare and the science is more important than African culture? What can we do?
Well, of course, you have to continue to keep talking with them, and if possible, try to get speakers such as Dr. Ben and others to come by your facility and become a part of the staff development, and so that the teachers can be educated. That's one of the other things I wanted to add about the education of our children. We must insist that teachers who teach our children receive some level of education. That includes the black teachers as well. Ultimately, we must even insist on the university level that the schools of education be made to, as a part of teacher training, that the teachers be made to undergo many hours of study in relationship to black culture.
1190, last caller right now at WLIB. Go right ahead, please. You're in the air.
Hello.
Hello.
My question was what can we do, like, with a lot of inner city, young parents that are, that do not have very much education themselves, and to try to educate them so they can teach their children. I came in on the last part of it, and I was wondering whether Dr. Wilson could kind of elaborate on that. Okay, the situation is a lot of public schools, or a lot of the young parents are on assistance, or, and a lot of them are very uneducated.
Yes.
So what can we do? And by the way, I think you're fantastic.
Thank you.
So what can we do?
Okay, again, we're going to have to reassess our school system. Somewhat like, 40% or more of the female dropouts indicate that they drop out as a result of pregnancy or marriage as such. And now, while this is a controversial issue, I'll bring it up anyway, where these students have been appropriately educated in regards to themselves and in regards to family life and been given an education in family and in sexuality, the tendency to have teenage pregnancy drops significantly. Also, to the extent that students have been appropriately prepared in the elementary schools to think well, write well, and do things well, and where, because they have this kind of training and they have confidence in themselves, they too are less likely to become impregnated, you see, because if they're doing well, then they have a sense of competence, they can see themselves graduating, and graduation becomes a very strong priority in their lives. They will exhibit some self-control. But I think education around sexuality is very, very important in this regard.
Dr. Wilson, 3 hours have went by.
very
very quickly. Let's do two things. I want to first of all make sure that we mention the location and telephone number for Harlem Graphic Arts Center, and also your book and the title and where people can get it.
Okay. One quick thing too. I mentioned in another context, and I want to talk about sexuality and society's right to regulate sexuality. Because I think we as a black community have sort of abdicated moral responsibilities in this area. And we must understand, even though in this day and age where people talk about doing your own thing and all this kind of stuff, that this is a backwards philosophy, that it is very necessary for society to regulate the production of children. Children is not something you have just because you feel like having them. And all societies try to regulate the production of children, because when children are produced out of line, it creates chaos. Your question again, though.
Your address and telephone number?
215 West 125th Street, the Print and Copy Center, 212-316-3280.
And the title of the book and where we can get it?
Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, My Place, Liberation Bookstore, Empire Baptist Bookstore. It's around.
Okay, great. Thank you for being with us, brother.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure, for sure. 1190 is WLIB. Our guest this afternoon, Dr. Amos Wilson, psychologist, author, professor, entrepreneur at the Harlem Graphic Arts Center, and certainly someone who won't be a stranger to these microphones at WLIB for sure. We'll take a break this afternoon, a final one before we move towards the Chronicle, reminding you that the key to tomorrow is what we do today, the decision to work or whether to play. Both have their place in the human life stream, but only one can achieve your dream. Remember that life is the ultimate trip once you learn to experience it, because in the end, experience is the best teacher. Stand by. The Black Chronicle is next, followed by Sports Rap 88, and of course the Urban Notebook with Kay Thompson at 1190 WLIB. It stands for World Leadership in Broadcasting. I'm Gary Bird from the place where nobody does it better.